Hi class, it's week 11 and this week we're talking about transpiration. But as promised, this segment is not assessed, it's an interview with Eliza Perry. Miss Eliza Perry works for the Whittlesea Council and she'll introduce herself in a moment. But it really helps for us to understand how the trees around us are managed. We just came back from doing a prac on our street trees and the carbon in our 5Ks, and we're going to head out again on Friday. But I'll let Eliza explain how her job at council pertains to vegetation.
Hi all, thank you Ruth for the introduction. So I work for the City of Whittlesea as the City Forest Project Manager, which is a newly created position in the Parks Department. So basically I'm in charge of projects like the infill street tree renewal program and also carrying out things like audits on our significant remnant red gums. So it's a fairly wide range of things that we do at council. There's a lot of different stakeholders that are involved in the management of trees, but that's sort of where I begin.
So what is it that council manages? I mean, like, so we have a lot of trees around us. Are they all council owned, or are they owned by the council? How does it work? So we have trees in our gardens, we have trees in the street and in the park.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting one. Often people see public space and they assume council straight away. Council's the first person to get the call if something goes wrong, and also to get the blame if they do, if people don't like something. So council does manage a really significant portion of the trees on public open space, but there's a different range of sort of government stakeholders involved. So you can imagine along creek lines, it might be a Melbourne Water owned area, or you've got areas like Parks Victoria, which have a separate sort of management area of different trees. Then you've got things like your street trees and your parks trees and your rural roadside trees and all that sort of stuff, which falls to council.
So what's involved with, so council owns those trees. What's involved in their management?
So again, it really depends the council, and particularly in our council, we have a significant growth area, which means it's a newly developed area. We have a really historic older area, which is your Laylaw and Thomastown sort of area. And then we've also got our sort of City of Whittlesea and completely rural area. So it's quite different how the trees are managed in each of those sort of sections. So for instance, in our street tree management, we have zone work. So we have an outsourced contractor that we manage that does all of our zone works. So the council is broken up into areas, and that ensures that each street tree or each street tree asset is looked after and documented, and we have a clear history on what works has been carried out on that asset.
So you mention assets, trees as assets. So it implies that they have some sort of value. Is this monetized somehow with council? Is the tree worth a certain amount of dollars? And if so, what is it that makes it worth something?
Yeah, definitely. Well, look, it comes back to how trees are managed. So we've got our zone works, which we have for trees that are in high risk areas like street trees, or also trees that are around playgrounds within a particular vicinity to a playground or a maternal and child health area, or just an area out the front of your, sort of local library areas that people are going to be congregating regularly. Those trees are managed in a particular way. Often also with our planning, we plan some of our more beautiful and historic older trees around these sort of buildings. So the building's put there because the tree is so beautiful, and it adds the character to the area. It's why people want to live there, and it's what makes it a livable area. So you can imagine that some trees, a little tiny twig that's just been planted, it'll cost you, say, $55 from Bunnings or whatever. So if trees are under a certain size and are small like that, we don't value them very highly because we can replace them at a fairly reasonable cost. Trees that are valued sort of more highly are trees that are either of a certain age or a certain significance for some reason. So it goes into a few different sort of ways of putting a value on them. At City of Whittlesea, we use the revised Burnley method. So the Burnley method was created, don't quote me, but about 1988, the original one. And basically that was because we had been using different sort of methods to value trees previous to that, but they were from other countries where the growth rates in the trees was quite different to Australian conditions. So the revised Burnley method came into effect when there was a lot of criticism from local industry to sort of say, this is too tricky or this isn't realistic enough or that sort of thing. So the revised Burnley method was then created, and that's through Melbourne University. So that's the one City of Whittlesea uses, but other councils use different versions. Some of the overseas ones are used in different councils. So, but it has held up in court as well. So that's largely how it's sorted out. We actually have an endorsed sort of plan to sort of show residents how we came to what we came to and why we manage trees in a particular way, which is a street tree management plan that's just free for people to see on the website. So that sort of gives you an idea of the calculation that's used or the equation that's used to come up with how much the tree's worth.
So you mentioned planting new trees. So what's the plan here?
Yeah, so again, that's a really, really interesting one. So there's a lot to look at when you're planting trees. There's obviously the species is really important to, you know, the size that the tree is going to get. But with our nature strips, there are a council area that is managed by the resident and maintained by the resident. So the tree is different to that. The tree sits separately and is managed by council. However, obviously, residents have a really direct link to the tree out the front of the property. So you can get a lot of complaints from that. And it's quite important to let sort of the residents know that it's part of a utility that actually provides them a service, which a lot of people don't realise. So it basically goes out, you know, it's planted out the front, and you have to sort of try and choose a species that is popular with a resident to an extent, but it has to have all the other functions that we require. It needs to work under power lines. It needs to work with storm water drains that are around it, or ABN connections, or Telstra pits, or any of that sort of thing. And then it needs to provide canopy cover. It needs to be able to withstand a expected 2-degree increase over the coming years in the climate. It needs to be able to be part of a biodiversity corridor. It needs to be able to cope with a range of functions, not to mention things like in the City of Whittlesea, we have an incredibly reactive clay soil. So being able to choose species that can cope with those conditions with very little maintenance is really important.
So when we did a survey outside the houses, what I noticed is, so the students came back with photos if they couldn't ID the plant, is that there seems to be a lot of, on the street, the same species again and again, you know, so actually the palette of biodiversity is quite small. And is there an advantage to having more trees of the same species versus a variety of trees for any of those ecosystem services?
Yeah, so look, that's a really interesting point. It depends on sort of how the town planning is at the time. So you'll notice that back in the 70s, when you know, landscape architecture wasn't a big industry. And you've got dribs and drabs of all these haphazard plantings of prunus and melaleuca and all that sort of thing. And it's quite, you know, you can really, it's like a snap in time when you look at it from a particular perspective, which is quite lovely. But they've got this sort of alternate planting type style. Now a lot of landscape architects would certainly want to see the rows of trees that you sort of associate with the leaf green suburbs of, say, you know, areas around Stonington or Boroondara.
Yeah,
where
well,
you've got
London plains, you know, those big.
that's it, the single species, and that is often a visual thing, and it also is really good for property prices. It's really good for residents to basically, residents like the feel of the area. So as far as their livability and as far as having the community accept trees as an asset and as an important part of their community, it's a really good communication tool to have those sort of long arching corridors. It's great to keep connectivity as far as people walking from around their neighbourhoods and walking from area to their sports field or to their tennis club, and there's a lot of sort of open space strategies that take that kind of thing into account.
So you mentioned a slight conflict between residents and trees sometimes exists, and we looked on Google Earth and went back in time at those aerial images, and we did notice that large trees disappear over time, especially from private gardens or backyards. So what's that conflict about? What's the complaint? Like, why not plant a whole bunch of trees?
Yeah, I'm with you. Why not plant a whole bunch of trees? So it's really interesting to see the really wide range of how people feel about trees and why. And there's a really big missing education link there. So a lot of people, of course, don't value the tree because they don't realise it's worth money. They don't realise it's one of the rare assets in council that increases in value. Everything else depreciates. Trees increase in value to a certain point. Once they're over a particular type of maturity, they then decrease in value. That's part of the revised Burnley method. So with valuing trees, they take into account the form, how long lived it is, how fast growing it is, all that sort of stuff is taken into account when you monetize a tree asset. But basically with the conflict that's there, it has to do with a really diverse range of things. So I'll give you an example. I was asked to remove trees this week. One of the reasons was, oh, because you planted an ugly tree and look at all the trees in my garden and you've planted this ugly tree out the front. Oh, well, shouldn't I get to plant the tree? I want to plant a species that's beautiful. And so that kind of thing is really, really common. So people who love trees, but they just don't want council to have that input into something so personal to them. So you've got other people who are 100% sure that the tree is going to cause damage to their property asset. And this is a really, really interesting one. As I mentioned, we have really, really reactive soils out in Whittlesea. And it's interesting to see that you can remove a tree and the soil is still going to move really heavily and cause damage to the property, whether the tree's there or not. But if the tree's not there, the resident can accept it. If the tree's there, it has absolutely nothing to do with soil in their mind, and they're under the impression that the tree is the culprit. So that comes into engineering reports and that kind of stuff, and it can get really quite messy and hard to manage with residents. So that's an extreme sort of case compared to what you get on a sort of day-to-day basis, where it's just that people often have a really strong feeling towards trees.
So at Victoria Markets, there's been an experiment a little bit, and actually the urban forest of Melbourne City, which we looked at during the prac, because they've done an incredible job, of course, a very small council and very few trees. So they actually map each individual and you can click on it and you know what species it is. But there they've done a lot of work on the cooling effect of trees during transpiration, which is what we're looking at this week. So the cooling effect of trees, for example, is something people might not be aware of, but our council's aware of it. Is that something that's taken into account in terms of a climate change adaptation? Are we planting more trees to try to cool down our streets? Or
yeah, absolutely. The heat island effect is something that's sort of fairly well understood, and we know that it's going to make cities really unlivable if we don't manage our urban forests really appropriately. So it's why the discussion with residents is so important, so that they have the understanding that having that planted now means that it's a livable area into the future, which is really good for them, it's really good for the community, and it's really good for the values of their property. So it's certainly important. At the moment, we've just had our Green and Whittlesea strategy out for consultation with residents. So the actions from that will sort of be made available sooner rather than later, which will be really useful. But basically that looks at increasing the canopy cover of the entire city by around 20 to 30%. So at the moment, City of Whittlesea has a really high proportion of our trees are under 5 meters in size. So, you know, over 50% of our trees are that small, which is too small to sort of help with those kind of effects that you're looking for.
So you mentioned the greening strategy. I mean, like, so of course there's trees, but there's other green stuff out there. So what else is being managed?
Yeah, sure. So so parks is a huge area that sort of looks after a really wide range of our assets, which includes all the trees, and also all the other assets like our garden beds, our turf assets, our waterways that often connect to Melbourne waterways. So everything from, wait one moment. So the waterways and sort of infrastructure around that kind of stuff. It also takes into account things like how we look after our sports fields and dog parks. All of those things are assets within themselves that allow people to come out into the community and use the public open space.
So it sounds like a really interesting area to work in. Is there a lot of, are you guys involved in research? I mean, like into which trees to plant, how to manage them, how to benefit from them, how that landscape mosaic operates best. So if I have green spaces here, should I perhaps extend this green space, or how are these decisions made from a scientific kind of perspective? Obviously, council decisions are made from, you know, it's politics, right? There's a lot of different voices, right? But the scientific voice, where does that come from? The voice you're voicing. I mean, like, is that from council research, or are you working with universities?
It's a bit of everything. So with trees, it's really, there's a lot of stakeholders, even within council, let alone outside of council, that deal with our tree assets. So you can imagine sustainability departments that do biodiversity strategies. It's really important to them. You've got conservation teams that it's really important to them. You've got arboriculture teams, really important to them. Parks teams, really important to them. Even your capital works teams that are trying to produce some of these sort of things, they're all stakeholders when it comes to our tree and park assets. And that doesn't even take into account the leisure side of things, which is massive in itself, which sits outside what I do. But when it comes to the research, often we work with industry bodies and consultants largely. We also work with different research institutions, depending on what kind of things we're dealing with. So an example of that would be we have students that work with our stormwater coordinator who deals with our WSUDs, which is our basically rain garden assets, you know, to see the catchment size and how much water flows in and that kind of stuff, and measures the turbidity in the water, just really standard stuff. And then we have different projects like the Woody Meadows project, which looks at, you know, planting out different types of plants that will be able to cope in our conditions with a certain amount of maintenance, so that we can, you know, sort of attach a monetary value to that and plan for the future with climate change. But largely what we use is consultants and industry leaders. So, for instance, contractors that have a proven track, you know, record of being able to produce a certain asset to a certain quality at a certain price. And we use their expertise. Subject matter experts like myself also advise and other people responsible for tendering those sort of contracts and getting those sort of expertise into what we're doing and why we're making the decisions.
Working in Whittlesea Council and in all the councils, I think, is such an interesting prospect. I mean, like, it's really using environmental science to adapt to climate change, to make our spaces better for biodiversity, for meeting carbon emission targets. I mean, like, it just seems like an exciting place to be, and you sound like you have a wonderful job.
It's good. It's good fun.
So say if I were an environmental science graduate or geography graduate or earth scientist with environmental science background, how would I like go about getting a job like yours, or those jobs that you talk about around from parks and all the other teams? I mean, like, what's the process here, and what kind of skills are they looking for?
Yeah, look, there's a really wide range of skills that are required, and there's a lot of different backgrounds. So you've got everybody from trade backgrounds to environmental engineering backgrounds to GIS backgrounds. So people have come from lots of different areas, conservation backgrounds, environmental science backgrounds. So probably the main skills that everybody is looking for in that is to have a really sort of overall comprehensive knowledge of what's going on. With council, being able to outsource specifics is often what occurs, but having those sort of soft skills where you can liaise with a really wide range of people and speak a lot of different languages, have an understanding that our assets are put in GIS layers, and being able to deal with asset teams, and having an understanding of the background of the hydrology, the soil hydrology, or the species that are required, or how the capital works are implemented. They're all really, really valuable skills. So being able to sort of develop or demonstrate any of those skills will certainly help you get your foot in the door. The good thing about council is, you know, there's a lot of opportunity to come in at a particular level and just have a go. And you can often work to the position that you need to. So if you've got a really, really wide range of soft skills like that, you'll tend to do all right, and council will often sort of help you out with getting a bit further education in things like contract management or procurement, or also project management, which are all really, really necessary more and more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of food for thought here. It's really interesting that this COVID year has forced everyone, and I'm sure you see it in your managed green spaces, forced everyone to look closer to home. Usually we'd going to Camp Rumbug and making all these measurements on natural systems. And I think almost like using the term urban forest is new for me this year, because I just go to the forest usually and we work on native vegetation. So the urban forest and the management of the urban forest, it has just become such a buzz during this lockdown period. And there are lots of studies showing how what green spaces you have around you is linked to how content you are with the lockdown. Which is, I mean, like everyone's just walking outside in the park, and because we really can't go anywhere else. And it's a brilliant job that council has done to maintain this through the years, even in those times that we weren't looking, right? So thank you for all the work you do in this space.
Pleasure.
And thank you, Eliza, for this really interesting insight to this type of role.
Yeah, well, I hope it was helpful. I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak.